Move! You don't belong up here! The man didn't lower his voice. He sharpened it, like he wanted the entire first-class cabin to hear. You people always get lost when money's involved. This isn't coach. Go find your section before someone has to drag you out. A ripple of silence cut through the cabin. Evelyn Cross, 44, black, calm-eyed, impeccably composed, stood in the aisle with her boarding pass folded once between her fingers. No designer labels, no entourage, just a charcoal blazer, clean lines, and the still posture of someone who had learned long ago that power didn't need permission to exist. She had built her career in aviation finance quietly. Mergers, capital structures, airline rescue deals, never attaching her name to headlines. Today, she was just a passenger on a commercial airline, seat 1A. Or so they thought. The man blocking her path leaned back into his leather seat with a sneer. Grant Holloway, 52, white, wealthy, politically connected, a frequent flyer who mistook proximity to power for ownership of it. His cufflinks flashed. His mouth didn't stop. "Look at her," he said loudly, glancing at nearby passengers. "Probably printed that boarding pass in economy and wandered up here hoping no one would notice. Happens all the time. Entitlement dressed up as ambition." A few nervous laughs, phones subtly angled upward. Evelyn met his gaze, not defensively, not apologetically. She simply spoke. "This is my seat." Grant laughed, short and cruel. "That's adorable, and I'm the pilot. Listen, sweetheart, airline policy is very clear about who sits where. You can't just manifest first class because you feel like it." She unfolded the boarding pass and held it out, not toward him, but toward the aisle. Seat 1A. A flight attendant hesitated. Another glanced at Grant, then back at Evelyn, uncertainty crawling across her face. The moment stretched and broke the wrong way. "Sir," the attendant said softly to Evelyn, "there seems to be a misunderstanding." Grant leaned forward, breath thick with entitlement. "Misunderstanding? No. This is exactly what it looks like. Someone testing the limits. I paid for this cabin. People like me keep this airline in business. She should be grateful she's even allowed on the plane." Evelyn felt the eyes, curious, judging, recording. She did not flinch. "I paid too," she said, calm, even. "And passenger rights don't disappear because someone else feels superior." That word, rights, irritated him. "Passenger rights?" Grant scoffed. "Don't lecture me. I fly more miles in a month than you've probably flown in your life, and I don't take lessons from whatever this is." The insult landed deliberately vague, worse than a slur. It gave him cover. The flight attendant stepped back. A second attendant whispered into a headset. Evelyn exhaled slowly. She had learned, years ago, that escalation is often what bullies crave, so she didn't give it to him. She waited. Grant mistook silence for surrender. "See?" he announced. "Quiet now. That's good. Save us all the trouble and go back where you belong." Two airport police officers appeared at the front of the cabin, summoned not by evidence, but by discomfort. Authority entered wearing assumption. "What's the issue?" one officer asked. Grant didn't wait. "This woman is refusing to move. She's in the wrong seat, creating a disturbance." Evelyn spoke before the lie could harden. "I'm in my assigned seat. Here's my boarding pass." The officer barely glanced at it. "Ma'am, airline policy gives us discretion to resolve seating conflicts quickly. We need you to cooperate." "By giving up my seat," she replied quietly. Grant smiled. "That's how this works," he said. "Compliance is easier than consequences." The word consequences echoed, ugly, loaded. Evelyn looked at the officer. "I am complying with every instruction except surrendering what is legally mine." A pause, an uncomfortable one. The officer sighed. "Ma'am, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Behind them, a man muttered, "Just move already." Another whispered, "Why is she causing trouble?" Evelyn felt the familiar weight, not fear, not anger, but the old knowledge of how quickly dignity is questioned when it comes wrapped in black skin and quiet confidence. She closed her eyes for half a second. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:14. When she opened them, she nodded once. Call whoever you need to call, she said. I'll wait. Grant rolled his eyes. Unbelievable. Dragging this out like she's important. The officers exchanged a look. We're going to need you to step off the plane, one said. The words landed like a verdict already decided. Evelyn gathered her bag, slowly, deliberately, not because she was defeated, but because she understood something no one else in that cabin did. This moment was being recorded by more than phones. As she stepped into the aisle, Grant leaned back, victorious. Next time, he said smugly, learn your place before you embarrass yourself. Evelyn didn't look at him. She walked forward, shoulders squared, silence intact, the kind of silence that doesn't retreat, only observes. Because what Grant Holloway didn't know, what no one in that first-class cabin could imagine, was that the woman they were escorting off a commercial airline was not losing a seat. She was about to move an entire system. If you've ever been judged before you were heard, if you've ever watched injustice happen in real time while others looked away, then what happens next with Evelyn will make you sit up straight. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with dignity. Voices to follow what quiet power really looks like, because when privilege realizes it's gone too far, it doesn't apologize, it doubles down. The plane door closed with a hollow thud. Inside the first-class cabin, the sound felt final, like a verdict delivered in silence. Grant Holloway exhaled with satisfaction, loosening his collar as if the air itself had improved. Finally, he muttered. Took long enough. A few passengers avoided eye contact. Others returned to their screens. One woman whispered, "That was uncomfortable," but said nothing more. Discomfort, after all, was easier than confrontation. The lead flight attendant forced a professional smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly." No apology, no acknowledgement, just erasure. Grant pressed the call button anyway. "Yes, sir?" the attendant asked. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said loudly. "I fly this airline constantly. I expect a certain caliber of clientele up here. Not confusion, not drama." The attendant nodded, jaw tight. "Of course, sir. We follow airline policy to ensure a comfortable experience for all guests," Grant smirked. "Good. Because I'd hate to think your passenger rights policy applies equally to everyone." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Up front, the cockpit door cracked open. The captain stepped out briefly, scanned the cabin, then leaned toward the purser. "Everything resolved?" he asked. "Yes," she replied quickly. "Passenger was removed." The captain nodded once. "All right then." Just like that, the system agreed with itself. Outside the aircraft, Evelyn stood in a narrow jet bridge corridor, flanked by two airport police officers. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The airport noise felt distant, insulated, muted, unreal. "Have a seat," one officer said, gesturing toward a metal chair. Evelyn sat, resting her bag at her feet. "You understand why this happened?" the other officer asked, arms crossed. "I understand why it was allowed to happen," she replied calmly. The officer frowned. "Ma'am, the airline has discretion when there's a disturbance. We acted according to policy." "Policy?" she repeated softly. "Not proof." A pause. "You could have avoided all this," he said. "Sometimes it's better to comply and sort it out later." Evelyn looked up. "And sometimes compliance teaches people they're right." The officer didn't respond. Down the corridor, a supervisor approached, clipboard in hand. "We'll need to rebook you on a later flight," she said briskly. "You can file a complaint if you wish." Evelyn nodded. "I will." The supervisor raised an eyebrow, unconcerned. "That's your right." Yes, Evelyn thought. So was my seat. Back inside the plane, Grant reclined fully now, scrolling through his phone. Notifications buzzed, messages from colleagues, a congratulatory text from a political aide, handled like a pro. People need boundaries. He chuckled. Then a vibration interrupted his smug rhythm, an alert from the airline's investor app. He ignored it. Another buzz. Louder this time. He glanced down. The stock ticker blinked. Briefly, unstable. Just a flicker. A dip too small to matter. Probably market noise, he told himself. The engines roared to life. As the plane taxied, a young flight attendant leaned toward the purser. "Do you think we did the right thing?" The purser didn't hesitate. "We followed procedure." "But her boarding pass wasn't our call," the purser snapped. "Don't overthink it." The attendant swallowed her doubt and turned away. In the terminal, Evelyn stood at the window overlooking the runway. The plane she had boarded rolled forward without her, steel and momentum carrying on as if nothing had happened. She took out her phone. No dramatic gestures, no angry texts, just one contact. She typed 4 words. "It's time. Execute review." The reply came instantly. "Confirmed." She slipped the phone back into her bag. Around her, travelers hurried. Announcements echoed. Life continued. But somewhere beyond the terminal, in servers, contracts, clauses written years ago, mechanisms began to stir. Quiet ones, patient ones, the kind no one notices until it's too late. Evelyn breathed in slowly, then out. She wasn't angry. She was precise. On the plane, Grant lifted his glass of champagne as the aircraft lifted off the ground. "To smooth flights," he murmured. He had no idea the turbulence hadn't started yet. If you've ever watched authority close ranks, if you've ever seen policy used as a weapon instead of protection, then stay right here. Like, subscribe, and remain with Dignity Voices, because what's coming next isn't loud, it's documented. Because when injustice is recorded, it doesn't disappear, it goes public. The video didn't go viral at first. It seeped. A shaky clip, 37 seconds long, posted by a passenger who hadn't planned to be brave. Only honest. The footage opened mid-aisle, voices overlapping, tension already sharp. "Ma'am, you need to stand up." "I'm not resisting." "Then stop making this difficult." The camera tilted. A wrist, a sleeve. The unmistakable sound of Velcro restraints tearing open the air. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the video had crossed a threshold no airline could control. Evelyn watched it alone, seated at a small cafe table near the far end of the terminal. The same clip, again and again. Not out of masochism, but study. The frame caught her face only briefly. Calm, steady, almost unreadable. That was what unsettled people most. Comment sections exploded. "Why is she being removed? She's not yelling. They didn't even check her boarding pass. This feels wrong." News outlets picked it up cautiously at first. Hedging language, passive verbs. Passenger removed following seating dispute. By evening, the tone sharpened. Black woman dragged from first-class seat despite valid boarding pass. A former federal prosecutor appeared on a panel, brow furrowed. "If this footage is accurate, we're looking at potential violations of passenger rights. At minimum, this raises questions of legal accountability." Another expert followed. "And corporate negligence. When frontline staff default to force instead of verification, that's not an individual failure. That's systemic." The words began to stick. Inside the airline's headquarters, the mood soured by the hour. A crisis response team filled the executive conference room. Screens glowed. Headlines refreshed faster than anyone could read. "We need to get ahead of this," the chief communications officer said. "Emphasize safety. Use the word non-compliant. That usually calms things down." Legal shook his head. "Careful. If she was compliant, and the footage suggests she was, that language could backfire." The COO scoffed. "We remove disruptive passengers all the time." "Yes," legal replied, "but not usually with this level of restraint, and not without confirming seat assignment." Silence followed. Someone finally asked the question no one wanted to voice. Who is she? No one knew, and that was the problem. Grant Holloway knew, or thought he did. He sat in the back of a black town car, scrolling through his phone, irritation turning to unease. His name hadn't appeared yet, but the comments were circling closer. Who complained? Which passenger demanded the seat? He fired off a text to a contact at the airline. This is getting blown out of proportion. Handle it. The reply took longer than usual. Back at the airport, Evelyn rose from her chair and walked, not toward the gate, but toward a quieter corridor lined with glass. The runway stretched beyond it, lights blinking in patient sequence. She felt the weight now, not of humiliation, but of exposure. Being unseen had always been safer. A young woman approached hesitantly, phone clutched to her chest. "Excuse me, are you the woman from the video?" Evelyn nodded once. "I just wanted to say," the woman continued, voice trembling, "I'm sorry no one helped. I froze. I didn't know what to do." Evelyn studied her face. Fear, regret, sincerity. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "Sometimes naming silence is the first step toward ending it." The woman swallowed, eyes wet. "They're saying you were difficult." Evelyn's voice remained steady. They always do. By nightfall, lawmakers weighed in. A senator tweeted, "If airlines can ignore passenger rights without consequence, we have a serious accountability problem." The phrase accountability problem trended for 6 straight hours. Airline stock wavered again, this time noticeably. Still, the official statement came out tone-deaf and sterile. "We regret any discomfort experienced and are reviewing the matter internally." No apology, no admission, just insulation. Corporate negligence, dressed as caution. Evelyn read the statement once. Then she closed the browser. She wasn't interested in public sparring. She was interested in timing. Late that night, alone in a hotel room she hadn't planned to need, Evelyn sat at the edge of the bed, shoes still on. The city hummed beyond the window. For the first time since the plane, her shoulders sagged, just slightly. Humiliation has an echo. It waits until you're alone. She bowed her head. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." Matthew 5:6. The words steadied her breathing. She reached for her phone again, not to scroll, not to respond, to prepare. The public thought this was the story. It wasn't. It was the prologue. At airline headquarters, a junior analyst stared at a screen, frowning. "Sir," he said cautiously to his supervisor, "I'm seeing unusual movement in shareholder alignment. Small blocks consolidating under a single entity." The supervisor waved him off. "Focus on the PR dashboard. But the timing, not now." The analyst hesitated, then obeyed. Across town, servers logged activity no one noticed yet. Clauses dusted off. Thresholds approached. Systems waking up. Grant finally received a call back. "We're handling it," the voice said tightly. "But you might want to stay offline for a while." Grant frowned. "Why?" A pause. "Because this may not end the way you expect." The line went dead. Grant stared at his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time since the plane, he felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, uncertainty. Evelyn lay back on the bed, eyes open, listening to the distant sound of traffic. Tomorrow she knew the noise would grow louder. Accusations, debates, think pieces. But noise wasn't power. Structure was, and structure was already moving. If you've ever been humiliated in public, if you've ever watched lies become headlines before truth could catch its breath, stay with this story. Like, subscribe and remain with Dignity Voices, because silence doesn't mean surrender. It means strategy. Because when the world is shouting, the most dangerous thing is a woman who stays quiet and starts deciding. Silence is not empty. It's selective. Evelyn learned that long before the runway, before boardrooms, before the way men like Grant Holloway mistook volume for authority. Silence was how you listened for truth and how you decided when to act. Morning light slipped through the hotel curtains in a thin blade, dividing the room cleanly in two. Evelyn stood on one side of it, already dressed, already composed. The city outside buzzed with commentary she hadn't joined and opinions she hadn't corrected. She didn't need to. Her phone rested face down on the desk. It had buzzed all night. Interview requests, legal inquiries, sympathetic messages, outraged ones too. She let them stack up untouched, like mail you read only after deciding what matters. She poured coffee, black, no sugar. At the desk, she opened her laptop and logged in. No passwords typed aloud. No hesitation. The screen shifted, not to email, not to news, but to a familiar interface she hadn't accessed publicly in years. The architecture was clean, spare, built for patience, built for moments like this. Across the country, the airline's leadership believed the worst had passed. They were wrong. At headquarters, the emergency meeting resumed under fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly unwell. "We're stabilizing," the Chief Communications Officer insisted, gesturing to the dashboard. "Sentiment is leveling. The apology language is being A/B tested." Legal cleared his throat. "There's a problem." There always was, lately. "We've received notice from a compliance review firm requesting internal documents related to passenger removal procedures," he said. "They're citing patterns." The COO frowned. "Patterns? Multiple incidents, similar language, same escalation triggers." "That's standard risk," she snapped. "We'll manage it." Legal hesitated. "They're not a standard firm." A pause. "Who are they?" the CEO asked. Legal checked his notes. "A private aviation governance group. Deep capital backing. Quiet." The room shifted. Quiet always meant serious. Evelyn scrolled through data most people didn't know existed. Not because it was hidden, but because it was boring. Share allocations, voting thresholds, governance triggers. Embedded years earlier, when the airline was smaller, hungrier, more honest. Back then, she had insisted on safeguards. Power needs a conscience, she'd told the board, and consciences need leverage. They had smiled politely and agreed. They never thought she'd need to use it. She paused on a single line item, dormant for years. Ethics Oversight Clause, activation pending threshold breach. The threshold was close, not yet crossed. She didn't click. Patience. On cable news, a panel debated whether the incident was racially charged or merely procedural. A commentator shrugged. "We don't know all the facts." Another snapped back. "We know she was compliant. We know force was used. At some point, ignorance becomes complicity." The host cut to commercial. Truth rarely fit between ads. In the airport, the young flight attendant from the first-class cabin sat alone in the break room, phone glowing in her hands. She watched the video. Again, the moment Evelyn looked at the officer, not with fear, not with defiance, but with something harder to name. Recognition. The attendant swallowed. She opened the airline's internal reporting portal, hovered over the cursor, then closed it. Fear won. For now. Evelyn stepped away from the desk and stood at the window. Planes rose and fell in smooth arcs, governed by physics, not ego. She liked that about aviation. Gravity didn't care who you were. Her phone buzzed again. This time she picked it up. A single message, no name displayed. "We're ready when you are." She typed back one word. "Wait." On the other end, someone exhaled. They trusted her timing. They always had. At airline headquarters, the CEO's assistant knocked softly and entered. "Sir," she said, "we've received an inquiry from a shareholder consortium requesting an emergency review session." The CEO frowned. "Which shareholders?" The assistant swallowed. "That's unclear. The request is bundled." Legal's eyes narrowed. "Bundled how?" "Multiple minority stakes. Consolidated." The room fell quiet. "That doesn't happen accidentally," Legal said. No one argued. Evelyn returned to the desk and finally opened her email. Not the top message, not the loudest one, but the oldest unread thread at the bottom. A note she'd written to herself years earlier, archived and forgotten. If they ever mistake restraint for weakness, remind them who built the rails they're standing on. She closed it. Then she clicked. The clause activated with no drama, no alarm, just a confirmation line appearing at the bottom of the screen. Status: active somewhere, far away. Servers acknowledged her decision. No fireworks, just alignment. That afternoon, Grant Holloway sat in his office, blinds half drawn, watching his phone with the unease of someone who sensed the air pressure dropping. He hadn't posted, hadn't commented. His advisor had told him to disappear for a few days. He hated that. Power to him was visibility. He didn't know that invisibility was already undoing him. As evening fell, Evelyn closed her laptop and slipped it into her bag. The room felt lighter, not because the problem was solved, but because it was now contained. She paused at the door, hand on the handle, and allowed herself one breath of reflection. Whoever is patient has great understanding, but one who is quick-tempered displays folly. Proverbs 14:29. She wasn't quick-tempered. She was exact. In the airline's executive suite, an alert pinged simultaneously across multiple devices. Emergency board session requested, mandatory attendance. No sender name, just a time, just a place. The CEO stared at the screen, pulse ticking louder in his ears. For the first time since the incident, he asked the question out loud. Who did we remove from that plane? No one answered. Evelyn E. stepped into the hallway and closed the door softly behind her. The noise of the world would return soon, louder than before. But for now, the quiet held. And in that quiet, decisions had been made. The boardroom had never felt so quiet. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the city skyline, polished and distant. Executives sat in high-backed chairs, devices muted, coffee untouched. The emergency board session had been called with no explanation, just a timestamp, a location, and a mandatory attendance notice that didn't allow refusal. Grant Holloway was not in the room. He hadn't been invited. That omission alone unsettled people. The CEO cleared his throat. Before we begin, does anyone know who initiated this meeting? No one answered. The screen at the end of the room flickered to life. Not a presentation, not a logo. A single line of text appeared. Ethics Oversight Clause. Active Legal felt his stomach drop. That clause hasn't been used in over a decade, he whispered. The door opened. Conversation died instantly. Evelyn Cross stepped inside. No announcement, no escort. Just the soft click of heels against marble and the unmistakable presence of someone who didn't need permission to enter a room she had helped design. Several executives blinked, unsure. A few recognized her, vaguely. A consultant from years ago. A quiet strategist who asked inconvenient questions during early expansion meetings. The CEO stood halfway, confused. Ma'am, this is a closed session. Evelyn met his eyes, calm, level. I know, she said. I called it. Silence expanded, thick, disbelieving. She moved to the head of the table and set her laptop down. Didn't sit yet. Legal found his voice. Ms. Cross, with respect, under what authority? She turned the screen toward them. Numbers, share blocks, voting alignment, ownership. Her name appeared at the top. Not loud, not decorated, just factual. Evelyn Cross, majority voting stakeholder. The CEO's chair scraped loudly as he stood. That's not possible, he said. You sold your position years ago. I sold visibility, she replied. Not control. The room erupted. That stake is fragmented, someone snapped. No single entity holds. This has to be a data error. Evelyn raised one hand. They stopped. I structured the fragmentation, she said evenly. Distributed ownership protects against hostile takeovers. It also prevents people from thinking power has disappeared when it's simply resting. She finally sat. The CEO's voice dropped. Why now? Evelyn looked at him, not accusingly, not triumphantly. Because yesterday, she said, your company dragged me off one of its planes. A beat. The memory hit them all at once. The footage, the headlines, the quiet certainty they dismissed her as irrelevant. You were the passenger? Someone whispered. Evelyn nodded once. No, she corrected. I was the test. The screen changed. Footage played, not the viral clip, but internal camera angles, boarding pass scans, staff timestamps. The moment verification was skipped. The moment force replaced procedure. Legal accountability written in pixels. Your employees followed instinct instead of policy, Evelyn continued. Your managers chose convenience over passenger rights. And your leadership issued a statement designed to protect optics instead of truth. She folded her hands. That is corporate negligence. No one interrupted. I didn't raise my voice, she went on. I didn't resist. I didn't demand special treatment. I simply declined to surrender what was lawfully mine. She paused, letting the weight settle. And your system failed. The CEO swallowed. What do you want? Evelyn considered the question, not because she needed time, but because precision mattered. I want this airline to remember what it claimed to stand for, she said, and I want the people who forgot to step aside. The screen refreshed again. Names appeared, positions, recommendations, resignations, immediate, non-negotiable. A board member stammered, You can't just— I can, Evelyn said gently. And I am. She clicked once. Votes registered in real time. Thresholds crossed. Authority transferred. No applause, no shouting, just inevitability. The CEO sank back into his chair, pale. This will destroy us. Evelyn shook her head. No, this will correct you. She stood. You will issue a full apology, not one written by legal, but one that admits harm. You will cooperate with every external review, and you will fund mandatory reforms designed by people who understand dignity isn't a branding strategy. She picked up her bag. And you will never again confuse silence for weakness. No one stopped her. They couldn't. Across town, Grant Holloway's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered anyway. Yes? A pause. Then his face drained of color. You're telling me— She's who? The line went dead. Grant stared at the screen, the echo of Evelyn's calm voice replaying in his mind. The one he'd dismissed, mocked, erased. For the first time he understood. The seat hadn't been the mistake. The assumption had. Evelyn exited the building into late afternoon light. The city moved around her, unaware of the shift that had just occurred. Justice hadn't screamed. It had signed. She paused at the curb, breathing evenly. Inside, the boardroom scrambled to keep up with a reality that no longer belonged to them. Outside, Evelyn walked on, intact, unbowed, unnamed by headlines. Because the truth had finally spoken, and it hadn't needed to shout. If you've ever watched someone underestimate quiet competence, if you've ever been dismissed because you didn't perform power, this moment was for you. Like, subscribe and stay with Dignity Voices, because what comes next isn't just justice, it's consequence. Because once identity is revealed, the system doesn't argue. It obeys. Power doesn't arrive with footsteps. It arrives with confirmation codes. Within minutes of Evelyn Cross leaving the boardroom, the airline's internal systems began to respond. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but with the cold obedience of architecture finally recognizing its architect. Emails triggered in precise sequence. Not blasts, not panic. Targeted notifications routed to compliance, finance, operations, and federal liaison offices. Each one carried the same subject line. Protocol activation. Immediate action required. Executives stared at their screens, stunned not by the language, but by the authority behind it. This wasn't protest. This was process. In the executive suite, the CEO stood frozen as the general counsel reread the notification for the third time. "She's invoking cross-functional override," legal whispered. "That authority hasn't existed in practice for years." "But it exists," the COO snapped, already scrolling. "That's the problem." Department heads began entering the room without being summoned. Compliance first, then HR, then an outside risk advisor who had been monitoring quietly for months, waiting for a breach threshold no one believed would ever be crossed. It had been crossed, not by malice, by arrogance. At the same time, across the city, Evelyn sat in the back of a town car, hands folded in her lap, eyes forward. She wasn't watching news. She wasn't reading messages. She trusted the machinery. Years earlier, when the airline had needed capital no one else would provide, she had insisted on ethical infrastructure, clauses no one bothered to understand, safeguards written in language too dull to attract attention. "Justice doesn't need passion," she told the board back then. "It needs permanence." Now permanence was answering. Inside the airline's operations center, a senior systems engineer frowned at his monitor. "Why are these permissions changing?" he asked no one in particular. Another analyst leaned over. "They're not changing. They're reverting. To baseline. To original intent." The first visible impact came quietly. The CEO's executive access was downgraded. No announcement, no escort. Just a blinking notification. Administrative privileges adjusted. He refreshed the screen. Nothing changed. "Legal?" he said, voice brittle. Legal didn't answer. He was staring at his own inbox. His privileges were gone, too. Across the building, phones buzzed in unison. Resignation notices delivered not as requests, but as outcomes. The system didn't ask if they agreed. It had already counted the votes. News broke 37 minutes later. Not from the airline, from the market. A financial network cut into programming with a red banner. Airline stock halted following governance review. Analysts scrambled. "This isn't a scandal-driven dip," one said live on air. "This is a structural correction. Something internal has shifted, and it's big." The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. A $4 billion valuation adjustment, erased not by rumor, but by recalculation. Grant Holloway watched the news in disbelief, tie loosened, jaw clenched. His phone buzzed incessantly. Advisors, colleagues, people who hadn't spoken to him in years, suddenly eager to distance themselves. He replayed the moment on the plane. "Next time, learn your place." The words curdled in his mouth. His influence evaporated faster than his confidence. When the airline's legal team issued a statement acknowledging procedural failure and cooperation with external review, Grant's name appeared nowhere. He wasn't protected. He was irrelevant. Back at headquarters, a federal liaison entered the room unannounced. "We've received formal notice of voluntary compliance cooperation," she said crisply. "Effective immediately, we'll be conducting a full audit of passenger removal incidents over the last 5 years. The COO slumped into her chair. The liaison glanced around. "I assume Ms. Cross is aware?" Legal laughed weakly. "She initiated it." The liaison nodded once. "Good." Evelyn's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. Phase 1 complete. External alignment achieved. She typed back, "Proceed to Phase 2. Public correction, not performance." The reply came instantly. Understood. By evening, the airline's public apology was released. Not polished, not defensive. It acknowledged harm. It acknowledged failure. It acknowledged the specific removal of a compliant passenger whose rights had been violated. The CEO did not sign it. An interim chair did. The message was clear without being stated. In the days that followed, consequences rippled outward. Mandatory retraining programs were announced, not outsourced, but internally restructured. The airport police department placed involved officers on administrative leave pending review. Civil rights organizations were invited, not for optics, but for oversight. This wasn't damage control. It was demolition of rot. A junior flight attendant sat at her kitchen table, watching the apology on her laptop, hands trembling. She remembered the moment she'd looked away. She logged into the internal reporting portal again. This time, she clicked Submit. Others did too. Silence cracked. Evelyn visited the original airport late one night, unannounced, unnoticed. She stood near the same gate, watching another flight board. Different faces, same structure. A janitor paused nearby. "They've been talking about that incident all week," he said casually. "Whole place feels different." Evelyn smiled faintly. Good. He didn't recognize her. She preferred it that way. At Airline headquarters, the interim chair addressed remaining leadership. "We didn't lose control," she said. "We were reminded who it belonged to." No one disagreed. Grant Holloway packed his office in silence. The seat was gone. So was the illusion. Evelyn returned home that night, removing her shoes by the door, setting her bag down carefully. The day had been long, not emotionally, but architecturally. Justice had moved through channels she trusted. She stood by the window, city lights steady below, and allowed herself one quiet breath of release. Not triumph, alignment. Because power used correctly doesn't humiliate, it recalibrates. And tomorrow, the system would wake up changed, not because of outrage, but because someone patient enough had finally decided it was time. The collapse did not arrive like an explosion. It came like weather. Slow, undeniable, and impossible to stop once the pressure system shifted. By the third morning after the boardroom session, the airline woke to a reality it could no longer narrate its way out of. Headlines hardened. Analysts stopped speculating and started concluding. The story was no longer about an incident. It was about a pattern, and patterns demanded reckoning. Inside headquarters, executives who remained moved carefully, as if sound itself could trigger another consequence. Hallways once loud with ambition now carried whispers and the hum of machines doing what machines do best, recording change. Human resources released notices not as announcements, but as acknowledgments. Positions were eliminated, departments restructured, titles quietly retired. No one used the word purge. They used realignment. It was more accurate. The interim chair stood before the remaining leadership and spoke without notes. She did not raise her voice. She did not soften the message. "We are not being punished," she said. "We are being corrected." No one argued, because outside that room, correction was already visible. Regulators arrived without fanfare. Not raids, not sirens, clipboards, credentials, measured steps. The kind of authority that didn't need spectacle because it was permanent. Airport police leadership announced cooperation. Internal affairs opened files that had been closed too quickly before. Names resurfaced. Decisions were re-examined. The system had turned inward. On social media, the tone shifted. Outrage matured into resolve. Commentators stopped asking how this could happen and began asking how often it had. Former employees spoke. Passengers shared stories that never made headlines because they hadn't been filmed. Silence lost its protection. The airline's stock reopened lower, then steadied. Investors didn't flee. They recalibrated. Long-term trust, it turned out, mattered more than short-term comfort. Evelyn watched none of it, directly. She sat in her home office, sunlight moving slowly across the floor, reviewing reports compiled by teams she had never needed to micromanage. They were doing exactly what they had been designed to do: identify weakness, remove rot, reinforce structure. Her phone rang once. It was the interim chair. "We're implementing the full reform slate," she said. "Independent oversight, mandatory verification checkpoints, zero discretion removals without documented cause." Evelyn listened. "And?" she asked. "And the board wants to know if you'll step back in, publicly." Evelyn looked out the window, where the city moved in quiet coordination. "No," she said. "You don't heal a system by replacing one face with another. You heal it by changing how it decides." The chair exhaled. "Understood." That was leadership now. Listening. Across town, Grant Holloway sat alone in a rented office, cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. His name had become shorthand in articles about entitlement, about assumption, about the dangers of unchecked influence. Invitations stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. He replayed the moment again and again and again. The certainty he'd worn like armor. The confidence that rules bent toward him because they always had. He finally understood what had broken. Not his reputation, his insulation. Elsewhere, the young flight attendant walked through the terminal in uniform, shoulders back. She had given a statement. Others had followed. Training sessions were different now. Questions were allowed. Verification was mandatory. Silence was no longer rewarded. At the same gate where everything had begun, new signage appeared. Clear language, clear rights, clear process. Passengers noticed. Weeks passed. The story stopped trending, but its effects did not fade. Lawsuits were settled quietly. Policy language changed. A Civil Rights Advisory Council was announced, not as a press opportunity, but as a standing authority. This was not restoration theater. It was reconstruction. Evelyn attended none of the press conferences. She declined interviews. She let the system speak for itself. When justice works, it does not need narration. One afternoon, she walked through the terminal again, not as a symbol, not as a spectacle, but as a traveler. No cameras followed her. No one recognized her. The space felt altered anyway. Calmer, more deliberate. She paused near the window overlooking the runway. A plane lifted smoothly into the sky, engine steady, path clean. The choreography was precise because the rules were respected. That had always been the point. Her phone vibrated. A final report. System reforms complete. Oversight active. No further action required. Evelyn closed the file. Behind her, a father explained boarding procedures to his daughter, pointing to the signs, reading them carefully. She listened, nodded, learned. That mattered more than headlines. The collapse was finished now, not with rubble, but with clarity. The old order had not been destroyed by anger. It had been replaced by design. And in that quiet replacement, something rare had occurred. Power had been reminded what it was for. In the weeks that followed, the airline's internal culture shifted in ways no memo could mandate. Meetings changed shape. Assumptions were questioned before they hardened. Verification replaced instinct. Employees learned that escalation was not strength, and restraint was not weakness. These were not slogans posted on walls. They were behaviors reinforced by consequence. External auditors published preliminary findings that confirmed what many had long suspected. The issue had never been a single employee or a single passenger. It had been permission. Permission to shortcut. Permission to assume. Permission to protect comfort over correctness. That permission was revoked. Airports affiliated with the carrier updated joint protocols. Law enforcement agencies revised response thresholds. Training scenarios were rewritten to include dignity as a requirement, not an afterthought. Paperwork multiplied, but so did clarity. Evelyn reviewed each change without commentary. Her role was no longer directive. It was custodial. She ensured the structure held, then stepped back again. Architects do not live inside every building they design. Grant attempted a statement. It was brief, defensive, poorly received. He withdrew it within hours. Some lessons arrived too late to save pride, but not too late to end harm. He would live with that distinction. The interim chair announced a permanent leadership slate. Diverse, experienced, unglamorous. People chosen for steadiness, not spectacle. The board ratified the decision unanimously. The vote was not close. Employees noticed another difference. When mistakes occurred, they were addressed publicly and proportionately. When passengers raised concerns, they were documented and resolved, not dismissed. Cameras became unnecessary because trust returned. Evelyn attended a small internal briefing by invitation only. She sat in the back, listened, and spoke once. "Systems don't fail because people are bad," she said. "They fail because good people are trained to look away. Don't look away." No one forgot it. On a quiet evening, she returned home and placed the folded boarding pass from that day into a drawer. Not as a trophy, as a reminder of how easily order can drift, of how quietly it can be restored. Outside, the city lights blinked in steady patterns. Somewhere, another plane landed safely, guided by rules that mattered. The collapse had ended not in ruin, but in resolve. And resolve, when maintained, becomes culture. The headlines eventually moved on, as they always do, but the correction remained embedded. People spoke differently now. They checked twice. They listened longer. And when someone stood their ground quietly, the room paid attention. This was not fear. It was respect earned by structure. Evelyn understood that justice is most effective when it outlives memory. She closed the drawer, turned off the light, and let the day end without ceremony. Tomorrow would not need her intervention. That was the measure of success. When systems hold, architects rest, and dignity no longer needs defending, only maintaining. The work continued unseen, sustained by rules rather than personalities, by patience rather than outrage, by accountability that neither slept nor shouted. It endured quietly where it belonged, and that endurance changed everything forever. For good. A year later, the airport felt different. Not quieter, airports are never quiet, but steadier. As if the place had learned how to breathe. The announcements flowed without urgency. Lines moved with purpose. The glass walls reflected a morning light that no longer seemed sharp. Evelyn Cross walked through the terminal alone. No escort, no press, no recognition. That was intentional. She wore a simple coat, her pace unhurried, her eyes attentive in the way of someone who observes systems not for flaws, but for alignment. The gate number overhead blinked softly. It was the same gate as before, though the signage had been redesigned. Clearer language, clearer rights, clearer processes. Small changes, structural ones. At a distance, a group of executives stood near a private conference room, speaking in subdued tones. Evelyn didn't approach, but she recognized the posture, careful, measured. The era of performative confidence had ended. One of them glanced her way, then looked again, uncertain. Recognition hovered, then passed. She kept walking. That too was intentional. Inside a modest boardroom overlooking the runway, the airline finalized the last documents of a long chapter. The settlement agreement lay signed, clean and unequivocal. It resolved claims without secrecy, acknowledged harm without deflection, and funded oversight designed to outlast leadership cycles. There were no victory laps, no disclaimers buried in footnotes. An executive apology had already been issued months earlier, not a press-crafted statement, but a plain-spoken admission delivered without qualifiers. It named what happened. It named why it was wrong. It named the obligation to do better. That apology had not erased the past, but it had realigned the future. Reputation management teams once obsessed with optics had been restructured. Their mandate shifted from narrative control to brand accountability, a phrase now embedded into governance documents, performance reviews, and escalation protocols. Accountability wasn't something you said after harm. It was something you practiced before it. From the runway window, a plane lifted smoothly into the sky. No one clapped. That was the point. Evelyn paused near the window where she had once stood watching a plane leave without her. She remembered the weight of that moment. Not anger, not humiliation alone, but the realization that dignity could be tested by strangers and upheld only by structure. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve nearby. "Why does that sign say to ask before moving someone?" he asked, pointing to a placard. The mother smiled. "Because everyone has a right to be treated fairly." Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not pride, but peace. Justice had done what it was supposed to do. It had taught. She sat briefly at the gate, not boarding yet, just listening. The rhythm of travel, the small negotiations of humanity, a man helping an elderly passenger with a bag, a flight attendant kneeling to speak at eye level with a nervous flyer. Procedures followed, Voices respectful. No one noticed Evelyn. She preferred it that way. Her phone buzzed once. A message from the interim chair, now permanent. Final audit closed. Oversight ongoing. Thank you. Evelyn typed back. Keep listening. That was all. As boarding began, she stood, presenting her pass. The agent scanned it carefully, verified it twice, and smiled. Welcome, the agent said. Seat 1A. Evelyn nodded and stepped forward. The first-class cabin looked the same. Leather seats, muted tones, soft lighting. But it felt different. No entitlement hung in the air. No casual arrogance. Just people traveling. She placed her bag overhead and sat. The seat accepted her easily, as it always had. The difference was never the seat. It was the system around it. Later, as the plane leveled off, Evelyn looked out the window at the thinning clouds. She allowed herself a moment of reflection, not on what she had taken, but on what had been restored. She thought of the officers now trained to verify before acting, of the employees encouraged to speak, of the executives who learned that leadership is custodianship, not control, of Grant Holloway, whose name had faded from relevance, not by revenge, but by consequence. Justice had not ruined him. It had removed his shield. There was a difference. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly and whispered a verse she had carried through every stage of the ordeal. He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6:8. Justice, mercy, humility, not one without the others. She understood now more clearly than ever that justice without mercy hardens into cruelty, and mercy without justice dissolves into permission. The balance mattered. So did timing. When the plane landed, she exited without ceremony. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The system held. Outside, the terminal doors slid open to a morning already in motion. Evelyn stepped into it, whole. This story was never about a seat. It was about what happens when dignity meets unchecked privilege and refuses to bend. True justice doesn't shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't need applause. It rebuilds systems so quietly that one day people forget they were ever broken. If you've ever been underestimated because you stayed calm, if you've ever been pressured to comply with something you knew was wrong, remember this. Your restraint is not weakness. Your patience is not permission. And your silence can be strategy. God's word reminds us that justice belongs not to the loudest voice, but to the steadfast heart, the one willing to endure, to wait, and to act when the time is right. The Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love. Psalm 33:5. May we build lives, workplaces, and systems that reflect that love, not in words, but in design. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in quiet power, moral courage, and justice done right, like, subscribe, and stay with Dignity Voices. Because the stories that change us most are the ones that remind us who we already are.